The subway roared beneath Manhattan like a steel heartbeat. The air smelled of oil dust and electricity. I stood near the yellow edge of the platform, my hands gripping my purse too tightly. My mother-in-law's perfume still sharp beside me. Margaret's reflection shimmered in the metal column. Calm, elegant, composed, like she hadn't just told me I was ruining her family. "You never deserved my son, Claire," she said softly, as if delivering a diagnosis instead of a threat. I tried to step back to put distance between us, but her hand caught my wrist. "You've embarrassed us long enough," she whispered, her voice almost tender. The arriving train screamed into the station lights flaring. Wind whipped my hair into my face. I saw her eyes, then flat determined, devoid of love. The crowd shifted. A man laughed somewhere. Then Margaret pushed. It wasn't a shove born of impulse. It was deliberate cold. Her palm slammed between my shoulders, propelling me forward. For a split second, gravity vanished, replaced by a hollow silence so wide it swallowed thought. Then came the fall. I hit the tracks hard, pain exploding up my knees. The headlight blinded me, the train's horn cutting through everything human. Someone screamed. I flattened myself instinctively between the rails as the metal thunder passed inches above my back. The noise was beyond sound, an earthquake inside my body. Sparks rained, heat scorched my skin. Oil dripped across my hair. 8 cars roared over me, and every second stretched like an eternity carved in iron. I didn't pray. I didn't think. I just held still, feeling death rush by. Then suddenly silence. My heartbeat filled the void. I opened my eyes to the darkness between the wheels and the gravel trembling. Somewhere above, people shouted. I heard Margaret's voice, high-pitched, pretending horror. She fell. Oh my God, she fell. I almost laughed. I pressed my palms into the oily ground and pushed myself up slowly. Muscles shaking, lungs burning. The train had stopped 20 feet ahead. I was alive. I shouldn't have been. When I climbed back onto the platform, faces turned pale. Margaret's did too, but not from relief. It was fear. I wiped the blood from my mouth, straightened my coat, and whispered words she couldn't hear over the chaos. I didn't die tonight, but something inside me did. 2 years before that night on the platform, I believed I had married into a dream. Daniel Lewis was everything I thought stability looked like. Calm, successful, the kind of man who called his mother every Sunday and never raised his voice. I used to think that kind of devotion meant he'd be a gentle husband. I was wrong. From the moment Margaret Lewis opened her front door on our first visit as an engaged couple, I felt it a chill that had nothing to do with weather. Her smile was wide, polite, almost perfect, but her eyes scanned me like I was a stain on her marble floor. An art teacher, she repeated after Daniel introduced me. How charming. The way she said it made the word sound like irrelevant. I laughed softly, pretending not to notice. Back then, I still believed that kindness could disarm cruelty. The first few months of our marriage were quiet, even warm. Margaret brought over flowers, cooked us dinner, and insisted on paying for our honeymoon. Family supports family, she said, though it felt more like a transaction. Then small things began to change. She'd drop by unannounced. She'd rearrange furniture to open the space. One afternoon, I came home from work to find her sitting on our couch, folding my laundry, sorting my mail. "You shouldn't tire yourself, dear," she smiled. "Daniel likes when things are done properly." I told myself she was just trying to help. But soon the help became control. She commented on what I wore, that color washes you out. She criticized my job. "Teaching art is a nice hobby, but don't you want a real career?" She started asking when I planned to give her grandchildren. When I said I wasn't ready, her face turned sharp. "You'll change your mind. Daniel needs heirs." At first, Daniel laughed it off. "She means well," he'd say, kissing my forehead. But every time I tried to set boundaries, he folded. "You know how Mom is," he'd whisper. "Just keep the peace." So I kept the peace. I swallowed the small insults, the subtle jabs, the way she inserted herself into every choice we made, from what couch we bought to which friends we invited over. Then came the night she crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I had stayed late after school to finish grading student projects. When I got home, Margaret was already there, standing in the kitchen with Daniel. On the counter were my art supplies, brushes, paints, sketchbooks spread out like evidence in a trial. "Daniel found your expenses," she said, holding up a credit card bill. $200 on paints. Is that what responsible wives do? Waste money. I tried to explain that it was for a student exhibition, but Daniel wouldn't look at me. Margaret smiled like a cat watching a trapped bird. "Artists," she said, turning to him. "So emotional, so impulsive. You'll learn, darling. You can't trust people like that with real responsibilities." That night, Daniel suggested I take a break from teaching. "Just for a few months," he said. "You've been tired." What he meant was, "Mom thinks you should stop." By spring, I was home all day. Margaret's visits became routine. She'd comment on how quiet the apartment was. "You must be lonely," she'd murmur. "Daniel works such long hours." She'd pause before adding, "That's why I call so often, to make sure everything's stable." Stable. The word began to feel like a cage. I started noticing how Daniel changed around her, straighter posture, clipped tone, no laughter. When she wasn't there, he was affectionate, tender. When she was, he became her echo. If I said something, he'd look to her before answering. Once during dinner, I mentioned missing my students. Margaret didn't even look up from her plate. "A woman's place is where she's needed," she said. Daniel nodded, eyes fixed on his food. I felt invisible. Weeks later, she brought over a maid, someone to help while you readjust. The woman was polite but watchful. She texted Margaret constantly. I noticed things disappearing, letters from friends' receipts, even my old phone. When I asked about it, Margaret shrugged. "You're forgetful lately, Claire. Are you feeling all right? Maybe you should see someone." That's when I realized what was happening. It wasn't kindness. It was control dressed as concern. She was erasing me slowly, piece by piece, until only her version of me remained, a quiet, obedient wife. I confronted Daniel one night. He sighed. "You always think the worst of people. Mom loves you. You're imagining things." But when I asked if he'd stand up for me, he looked away. "She's all I have," he said softly. I remember standing in our kitchen, the lights flickering, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. For the first time, I felt something shift inside me, not anger yet, but awareness. The kind that burns quietly, waiting. What I didn't know then was that this awareness would one day save my life. By the end of that first year, Margaret had woven herself into every corner of my life. I didn't notice it happening at first. That's how control works. It doesn't break down the door. It slides quietly through the cracks and rearranges the furniture while you sleep. She began calling Daniel every morning before he left for work, giving him little reminders. Then she started calling me, asking what I planned to cook for dinner, how I spent the day, whether I'd spoken to any of my old friends. Every question sounded harmless. Every word had barbs. When Daniel came home, he'd repeat her observations as if they were his own. "You've been home all day, Claire. The least you could do is make dinner, or Mom says you seemed distracted when she stopped by." I started to feel watched even when I was alone. One evening, I walked into the living room and found Margaret seated on our couch again, this time holding my phone. She smiled like she owned the air in the room. "You should be more careful, dear. You left this unlocked." I took it from her hand, pulse racing. "You went through my messages." "Of course not," she said too calmly. "I just worry about what kind of people might text you. Some of them don't seem right for a married woman." Her tone dripped with sanctimony, the moral superiority of someone who sins while quoting scripture. Later that week, Daniel confronted me about an old college friend, someone who had messaged me about an art exhibition. "Why are you hiding things from me?" he demanded. My throat closed. Margaret's words echoed from the hallway. "Secrets destroy families." I began to understand she was rewriting my reality, one conversation at a time. By autumn, she had convinced Daniel that I was unstable. She whispered about my moods, about how I sometimes forgot things. She told neighbors that I'd suffered episodes since childhood. When I tried to confront her, she tilted her head in pity. "You really should rest more, Claire. Stress can make people imagine things." That winter, I caught the maid, her spy, taking pictures of my sketchbooks. "Mrs. Lewis just wants to keep them safe," she said. Safe. The word twisted in my stomach. I called a former colleague from the art school just to hear a familiar voice. "You sound tired," she said. "Is everything okay?" I wanted to tell her everything, that my mother-in-law was hollowing me out from the inside, but the fear of being dismissed was stronger. I told her I was fine. Then one night, I found a small envelope tucked under the bedroom door. Inside were my medical records copies stolen from my doctor's office. At the bottom of the last page, someone had scrawled a note in Margaret's elegant handwriting. "He deserves a healthy wife." When I showed Daniel, he accused me of forging it. She'd never do that. "You're twisting things again." He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. I sat on the floor until sunrise, my back against the wall, staring at the envelope. That morning, I made a decision. I would stop reacting. I would start recording. I bought a small digital recorder and hid it in a vase near the kitchen table. I began documenting everything: her insults, her manipulations, her contradictions. "You're part of this family, Claire," she'd say sweetly one day. The next, "You'll never be a real Lewis." I collected her words like ammunition. One evening during dinner, Margaret deliberately knocked over a glass of wine onto my sketch pad. Daniel laughed awkwardly. "It's fine, honey." She didn't mean to. Margaret dabbed at the spill with a napkin, smiling. "Accidents happen," she said. Then she looked at me and added, "Some things just aren't meant to last." I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. Weeks later, I noticed changes in our finances, payments I didn't recognize, withdrawals I hadn't made. When I confronted Daniel, he brushed me off. "Mom's just helping manage things while you get back on your feet." "Back on my feet," I repeated. "When did I fall?" He sighed, already retreating. "You're making everything harder than it needs to be." That night, I checked our joint account online. Margaret's name appeared as co-signer. My stomach twisted. She had taken everything: our money, our home, my independence, while convincing everyone she was the savior. I went to her the next day, shaking but resolute. "You need to stop. You're destroying us." She smiled, standing by the window with her pearls glinting in the light. "Us, my dear, there was never an us. There's my son, and there's the woman who keeps disappointing him." I said nothing. She stepped closer. "Do you know why I've been patient with you, Claire? Because Daniel needs to learn what kind of woman not to marry next time." Her words cut deeper than any slap. I remember thinking she was capable of anything. Anything. I left her house that day knowing the line between cruelty and violence was thinning. I also knew I couldn't count on Daniel anymore. He was too far gone lost in her shadow. That night I hid the recordings in an old paint can under the sink. As I sealed the lid, my reflection in the metal was barely recognizable. Tired eyes, clenched jaw, something fierce blooming where fear used to live. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about surviving her control anymore. It was about preparing for the moment she'd go too far. And she would. She always did. Spring came early that year, but the light didn't feel warm anymore. It felt sterile, like a hospital room where everything living had already been drained away. I woke up one morning to find that Daniel's side of the closet was empty. He was gone before sunrise, leaving a note that said only, "Staying at Mom's for a few days." I wasn't surprised. By then, Margaret had already convinced him I was unwell. She had planted the idea so carefully that he believed it was his own. A week later, she called. "Daniel's worried sick about you," she said, her tone the perfect imitation of concern. "He thinks you should see someone. You know, for your nerves." I almost laughed. Nerves. The word belonged to another century, one where women were locked away for feeling anything at all. I hung up without replying. That evening, I heard a key in the lock. It wasn't Daniel's usual rhythm. When the door opened, both of them walked in, him stiff and pale, her radiant and calm. "We're here to talk," Margaret said. "No arguments." She set down her purse, surveying my apartment as if she already owned it. Daniel stood behind her, eyes unfocused. She handed me an envelope. Inside was a power of attorney document. "Just sign this," she said sweetly. "Daniel can handle the bills while you rest." My heart hammered in my chest. "Rest," I repeated. "You mean give up control of everything?" "Oh, Claire," she sighed, feigning pity. "You always twist things." I tore the papers in half. Daniel flinched. Margaret's eyes turned sharp. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "One day you'll regret treating me this way." I didn't sign. 2 days later, our bank accounts were frozen. My phone stopped working. The landlord called to say the rent had been paid 6 months ahead by Margaret and that she'd handle everything while I recovered. I wasn't even a person anymore. I was a problem to be managed. Then came the final humiliation. Daniel arrived one afternoon with 2 police officers. "It's just a wellness check," he said. Mom called. "She's worried." I stood in the doorway while one of the officers scanned my face, my trembling hands, my messy apartment. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked softly. I nodded, but something inside me fractured. Watching Daniel stand there silent while his mother painted me as unstable felt like witnessing my own erasure. After they left, I sat on the floor beside the window until the city lights blurred into streaks. My body felt hollow, my thoughts heavy. I realized that Margaret had already won the game, at least the one she was playing. I was cornered, stripped of money, reputation, and love. The next morning, Daniel returned alone. He looked exhausted older. "Mom says we should spend some time apart," he said quietly. "Just until things calm down." I stared at him, searching for any trace of the man I married. There was none. "And if I say no," I asked. He didn't answer. That was the day I packed a small bag and left the apartment. I took the subway downtown, my first act of defiance in months. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to breathe without her perfume choking the air. 3 days later, she called. Her voice was cold this time. "You can't run from me, Claire. I know where you are." My stomach twisted. She wasn't bluffing. She'd tracked me somehow. "We should talk," she said. "At the station near your school, tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock. Something in her tone was different, too. Calm, too final. But I went. Maybe it was pride, maybe curiosity, maybe the tiny part of me that still wanted to believe she wouldn't cross that last line. The platform was nearly empty when I arrived. The hum of the tracks filled the silence. I saw her before she saw me standing near the edge wearing her signature pearls and that immaculate beige coat. She looked more like a politician than a mother. "I came like you asked," I said. "What do you want?" She turned, smiling faintly. "Closure." Her eyes scanned me from head to toe, lingering on the bruises under my eyes. "You've made such a mess of things," she murmured. "Daniel's embarrassed. The family's humiliated. I tried to help you, but you just keep fighting." "I'm not your project," I said. "You can't fix me." She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the concrete. "You're right," she whispered. "Some things can't be fixed, only removed." The sound of the approaching train filled the tunnel. The lights flickered. I felt her hand brush my arm, then grip my sleeve. Her smile didn't change. For a heartbeat, I thought she was steadying herself. Then she pushed. The world tilted. The platform vanished. For an instant, I was weightless. As the train roared closer, time-fractured light wind sound all blending into one deafening scream. When I hit the tracks, the air exploded from my lungs. My hands scraped gravel. I turned my head just in time to see her face above me serene, framed by smoke and light. She mouthed something, maybe goodbye, maybe finally. And then the train swallowed everything. When the train stopped, I didn't move. For a moment, I didn't even believe I was still alive. The metal had thundered over me like a storm of gods, and yet my body was intact, bruised, trembling, but whole. My ears rang with the aftershock. I could smell iron sweat dust and my own fear. People were screaming above someone shouting for help. Then I heard her voice. Margaret's, laced with fake panic, shrill and rehearsed. She fell. Oh, God, she fell. The hypocrisy of it made bile rise in my throat. I crawled forward on my elbows, dragging myself between the rails until I reached the dark gap at the end of the platform. My vision pulsed. My hands were slick with oil and blood. I waited until the crowd's noise shifted toward confusion and chaos, then pulled myself into the maintenance passage. It was narrow, damp, reeking of rust and electricity. I crouched there for what felt like hours, shaking uncontrollably. My heart wouldn't slow down. I don't remember leaving the station. I remember the cold air outside hitting my face like a slap, the flicker of police lights, the crowd gathered behind tape. I remember seeing Margaret's silhouette at the edge of it all, perfect posture, arms crossed, pretending horror for the cameras. I remember realizing that if I stepped back into that light, she would win again. She would cry, tell them I jumped, and Daniel, obedient as ever, would nod. So I walked away. Not fast, not slow, just enough to disappear. I spent that night in a 24-hour diner in Queens, my clothes stained with oil, my hair tangled, my mind replaying the moment her hand hit my back. The waitress kept refilling my coffee without asking questions. "You okay, hon?" she asked once. I nodded. "Rough night." She gave a small smile. "You'll get through it. You look like a fighter." I wanted to believe her. I took a bus to a small town upstate the next morning, paid cash, checked into a cheap motel with flickering lights and walls thin enough to hear strangers dream. I slept for 16 hours straight. When I woke up, the world was quiet again, but something inside me had changed. I no longer felt fear, just focus. The news spread fast. "Wife of business executive dies in subway accident," the headlines said. Margaret gave interviews, eyes glistening, voice trembling just enough. She was troubled, she told reporters. "We tried to help her." The words crawled across the TV screen as I watched from my motel bed. Troubled. The same word she'd used to destroy me. I stayed dead for 3 months, long enough for her to grow comfortable in her victory. Long enough to plan. I dyed my hair dark, cut it short, and took a new name, Anna Clark. The motel owner didn't care who I was as long as I paid on time. I picked up shifts at a small art supply store. It felt poetic paintbrushes color all things she had tried to strip from me. At night, I sketched her face from memory. Every wrinkle of disdain, every perfect curl, every mask of virtue she wore in public. I didn't draw to forgive. I drew to remember. One afternoon, I found the courage to call an old student who now worked at a gallery in the city. "This is Claire," I whispered. Silence. Then she said, "Oh my God. They said you were—" "Don't say it," I cut in. "Listen, I need information." Over the next weeks, I pieced together everything. Margaret had inherited control of Daniel's company assets under the pretense of managing grief. The police had closed my case after a brief investigation. Accidental fall, the report said. Daniel had moved back into his mother's estate. Public sympathy had turned Margaret into a local saint. She'd even launched a charity, the Claire Foundation, to support women struggling with mental health. The irony almost broke me. But instead, it crystallized me. I bought a cheap laptop and used a prepaid hotspot to start digging. Property records, tax filings, bank donations, everything she touched had a paper trail. And for the first time in years, I wasn't scared of her. I was hunting her. Every night I wrote in a notebook what she took, what she said, what she did. I listed it all, not for vengeance, but for clarity. Because I finally understood something surviving wasn't enough. I had to show the world what she really was. By the end of that month, I'd gathered more truth than any police file ever could. I found forged documents, shell companies' fake charity accounts. She was stealing from the very women she claimed to help. And then came the moment that cemented my resolve. A clip surfaced online. Margaret at a gala, her hand on Daniel's arm, smiling for photographers. A reporter asked how she coped with my death. She paused dramatically and said, "When God takes one of his troubled children, we must find peace in his wisdom." I remember staring at her face on the screen, calm and untouchable, and whispering to the empty room, "You won't find peace. Not from me." That night, I burned my old ID, my wedding photo, every trace of who I used to be. Watching the plastic curl in the flame felt like watching a body burn. Mine, the one she buried. The woman who rose from those ashes wasn't fragile anymore. She was deliberate. She was quiet. She was patient. And she had a plan. 3 months after my death, Margaret Lewis was the most respected widow-in-law in New York. The tabloids adored her. "A pillar of grace amid tragedy," one headline read. She wore my death-like jewelry, something polished, something that made her shine brighter. And every photo of her at a charity event smiling beneath chandeliers reminded me that monsters don't hide in shadows, they thrive under spotlights. I started watching her from afar. Social media made it easy. She'd post pictures from fundraisers holding champagne glasses, hugging politicians, delivering speeches about mental health awareness. The name of her new organization made my stomach turn, the Claire Foundation. She had stolen my name to build her empire of lies. I moved back to the city under a new identity, Anna Clark. I rented a small studio above a laundromat and worked nights cleaning offices. By day, I watched. I visited her galas, her press conferences, her charity dinners, always in the background, always unseen. I learned everything: her driver's route, her accountant's habits, her board members, her vulnerabilities. Then I met someone who could help me. His name was Victor, an investigative journalist whose articles about nonprofit fraud had once brought down a senator. I didn't tell him my real name at first. I told him I'd worked for the Lewis family and seen irregularities. He was skeptical, but when I handed him the financial records I'd copied years ago, his eyes sharpened. "You realize this could destroy her," he said. "That's the idea," I replied. Together, we spent nights cross-referencing documents tracing donations that never reached their supposed recipients. Margaret's charity was a shell. 95% of its funds were funneled into offshore accounts tied to her and Daniel. Every receipt, every signature was proof. But I didn't want just proof, I wanted impact. Victor helped me craft a plan, a 3-phase operation as he called it. Phase 1 exposure. We began with whispers. Victor published a vague article hinting at a prominent charity under investigation for financial irregularities. No names, no accusations, just enough to make her sweat. Within days, social media buzzed with speculation. Margaret responded with confidence, appearing on morning shows. "Every dollar we receive helps women like my late daughter-in-law who suffered so much," she said, placing her hand over her heart. I watched her speech from my apartment, sipping black coffee, smiling. Then a week later, Victor released the second article. This time it named the Claire Foundation. He included screenshots of internal emails, her own words, casual and cruel. "As long as they believe the sob story, they'll donate." He didn't mention me, not yet, but the walls were closing in. Her lawyer issued statements. Her PR team scrambled. For the first time, Margaret looked rattled. I saw it in the tremor of her hand during a televised interview. She blamed miscommunication, called it an administrative oversight, but the audience wasn't buying it anymore. That's when I moved to Phase 2 legal strike. I reached out to an attorney, a woman named Teresa Nguyen, who specialized in domestic abuse and fraud cases. I told her everything: the control, the gaslighting, the attempt on my life, the forged paperwork, the charity built from my name. Teresa stared at me for a long time. "You understand what this means," she said quietly. "You'll have to come back from the dead." I nodded. Good, let her see the ghost she made. The lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later. It hit every morning show in the country. Claire Lewis returns alive. Files attempted murder and fraud suit against mother-in-law. The footage of Margaret walking into the courthouse looked like slow death. She wore black, her trademark pearls gleaming like teeth. When she saw me for the first time alive, standing across the hall, her face froze. I watched the color drain from her cheeks. She whispered something under her breath. Maybe a prayer. Maybe a curse. The reporters shouted questions. "Mrs. Lewis, did you push your daughter-in-law onto the subway tracks? Is it true you embezzled from your charity? What do you have to say to the survivors you claim to help?" She didn't answer. For once, the woman who had always controlled every word was speechless. In court, the evidence spoke for itself. The audio recordings I'd hidden years ago, her insults, her threats, her laughter played aloud. The bank statements connected every stolen dollar. The CCTV footage from the subway station sealed it, a blurred frame of her hand pushing me just as the train lights approached. Daniel sat behind her, his head in his hands. He looked smaller than I remembered. When he took the stand, his voice shook. "She told me Claire was unstable," he said. "She told me she'd handle it." He hesitated, then looked at me. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't." The courtroom was silent. Margaret's lawyer tried to argue mental distress, grief, confusion. But there was no confusion left to hide behind. The truth was carved into every piece of evidence. And then came Phase 3 public humiliation. Victor released a final exposé titled "The Queen of Charity Lies Beneath the Pearls." It detailed every manipulation, every fabricated story, every dollar stolen. It went viral overnight. TV anchors dissected her downfall. Women who'd once admired her flooded comment sections with rage. Sponsors withdrew. Politicians who had shared stages with her deleted photos. When she finally faced the press again, she looked nothing like the woman I once feared. Her makeup couldn't hide the cracks. Her voice trembled. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said. "I only wanted to protect my family." I stood in the crowd outside the courthouse that day, hood up unnoticed among the reporters. I watched as she stumbled through her statement, as Daniel avoided her gaze as the cameras captured her collapse. When the judge read the verdict weeks later, I was there too, front row. Margaret Lewis, he said you are found guilty of attempted murder fraud and obstruction of justice. The words hung in the air like bells tolling the end of a reign. You are hereby sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The sound of cameras clicking filled the room. Margaret didn't cry. She just turned to me and whispered, "You'll regret this." I met her eyes. "No," I said softly. "I'll remember it." Daniel was sentenced to 5 years for aiding and abetting financial crimes. He never looked at me again. Outside, the world felt quieter. The headlines that week called it the fall of a matriarch. But to me, it wasn't about her fall, it was about my rise. For the first time in years, the air tasted clean. Victor called that evening. "It's over," he said. I smiled faintly. "No," I replied. "It's beginning." Because justice wasn't a single moment. It was a slow restoration. It was reclaiming my name, my story, my peace. The next morning I visited the subway station. The same platform, the same hum beneath my feet. I stood at the edge where she had pushed me where I'd nearly died and watched a train thunder past. I didn't flinch. A woman nearby glanced at me, perhaps sensing something in my stillness. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," I said, watching the reflection of the train fade into darkness. "I'm just remembering." She smiled politely and walked away. I stayed there until the platform emptied, until the echoes of steel and wind softened into silence. Then I whispered to the rails, to the ghosts of who I used to be. She buried me here. But this is where I learned to rise. And for the first time, I felt free. The courthouse smelled like cold marble and paper sterile, detached, the kind of place where truth felt both heavy and clean. I sat at the plaintiff's table while reporters whispered from the gallery, pens ready. Margaret sat across the room, her pearls gone, her posture deflated but her eyes still sharp, searching for weakness. She found none. I wore black, not mourning, but armor. When the judge entered, the entire room shifted into silence. The first witness was a former accountant from the Clare Foundation. His voice trembled as he admitted that funds had been rerouted through shell companies linked to Margaret and Daniel. "She said it was standard procedure," he whispered. "She told us not to ask questions." Next came the subway surveillance footage. The lights dimmed as the grainy video flickered onto the courtroom screen. There it was, me standing near the platform edge, her behind me, the push, the chaos, the train's flash. Gasps echoed through the room. I watched Daniel cover his face with both hands as if blocking out what he'd helped create. Margaret didn't flinch. When the prosecutor asked if she had anything to say, she lifted her chin and said she was unstable. I tried to save her. The courtroom murmured. I leaned forward, my voice calm. "You didn't try to save me, Margaret. You tried to erase me." That sentence landed like a strike. Even the judge paused before nodding for the next question. When Daniel took the stand, his voice cracked. "Mom said Claire was dangerous," he stammered. "She said she'd ruin everything if I didn't let her handle it." He turned toward me, eyes red. "I didn't know she'd—" His voice broke. "I thought she just wanted to talk." Margaret's lawyer tried to twist the story. "Isn't it true that you suffered from stress, Mrs. Lewis? That you once sought counseling?" I smiled faintly. "Yes," I said. "Because living under her control would drive anyone to seek help. Therapy saved me. She tried to use it to bury me." Every word I spoke felt like reclaiming oxygen. When the judge read the verdict days later, the world seemed to hold its breath. Margaret Lewis is hereby found guilty of attempted murder fraud and embezzlement. The gavel struck once final, echoing like thunder in marble. Sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Margaret stood slowly. She didn't cry. Her mask didn't crack. She turned her head toward me, and for the first time I saw something like confusion, like she still couldn't understand how her empire had fallen apart. "You'll regret this," she whispered again. I met her eyes unflinching. "I already did," I said. "Now it's your turn." She was led away in cuffs, her pearls replaced by steel. Daniel received 5 years for financial collusion. He avoided my gaze the entire time, though I noticed the tremor in his hands. Maybe guilt, maybe fear, maybe both. Outside the courthouse, the air was bright, the kind of cold that burns clean. Reporters crowded around microphones thrust toward my face. "Claire, do you have a statement?" one of them asked. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "This isn't revenge," I said. "It's accountability. And it's what every survivor deserves." The clip played on national news that night. People called me brave, resilient, inspiring. But I wasn't any of those things. I was just a woman who finally stopped letting someone else write her story. In the following weeks, Margaret's empire collapsed completely. The Clare Foundation was dissolved. Investigators discovered millions hidden offshore. Every name that once praised her now vanished. The mansion she'd ruled from was auctioned to pay legal fees. Her charity's office was boarded up its sign, helping women heal still visible beneath the dust. Victor's final article went live the same day she was transferred to prison, The Queen of Charity, A Legacy of Lies. It ended with a single quote from me. She tried to teach me submission. I learned strategy instead. People started sending letters, women who had been silenced by their families, their bosses, their abusers. They thanked me for speaking. Some asked how I survived. I didn't know how to answer. Survival wasn't a single decision. It was 1,000 quiet refusals to die. One morning, I visited the prison, not to see her, just to see the building. It was gray and distant, surrounded by barbed wire and silence. I stood outside the gate, breathing in the sterile wind, imagining her inside, pacing, replaying the moment she lost control. "Do you feel better now?" Victor had asked me once. "No," I'd said, "but I feel lighter." That was the truth. Justice doesn't erase pain, it just stops the bleeding. That evening, I walked the streets of the city again. No disguise, no fear. The lights looked different now, warmer, less like traps. I passed a newspaper stand. Her face stared back at me from the front page under the headline, "From Matriarch to Monster." I almost felt pity. Almost. When I reached the subway station, I hesitated at the top of the stairs. The hum of the trains rose from below, steady and familiar. I went down. The same yellow line, the same rails, the same echo of metal and time. I stood at the edge again, but this time I wasn't trembling. The wind of the oncoming train brushed my face cool and powerful. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Not fear, never again." When the train passed, I stepped back, smiling faintly at the reflection in the metal doors. I wasn't the ghost she buried anymore. I was the woman who returned. And when the doors opened, I stepped inside, leaving the platform and her shadow behind. 6 months after the verdict, the city had changed, or maybe it was me. The noise didn't bite the same way anymore. The subway, once a symbol of fear, had become a heartbeat, again steady human alive. I rented a new studio in Brooklyn, small but bright, with paint-stained floors and wide windows that let in morning light. For the first time in years, I woke up without checking my phone for messages from someone trying to control me. Silence had become my favorite sound. My days settled into rhythm. Mornings were for painting, afternoons for teaching small art classes at a community center. At first, I only had 3 students, women who barely spoke, whose hands trembled when they first touched the brushes. Some had bruises fading under their sleeves. Some had stories they couldn't yet tell. I didn't ask. I just taught them how to mix colors until they found shades that felt like breathing again. One day, a woman stayed after class. Her name was Nora Mid-50s Quiet Eyes. She hesitated before speaking. "I read about you," she said softly. "The woman who came back." I smiled. "That's one way to put it." She looked at the canvas she'd been painting, a storm clearing over an ocean. "You make me believe it's possible. To survive. To start again." I didn't know what to say. Instead, I handed her a clean brush and said, "Then keep painting. The world needs proof." In the evenings, I'd walk by the river, letting the wind tangle my hair. Sometimes I'd stop at the newsstand near the corner where my life had once fallen apart. Margaret's name still appeared occasionally, appeals, denied funds, recovered the slow machinery of justice grinding on. But her photos had lost their luster. The world had stopped admiring her. She had become what she always feared most, forgotten. I never visited her in prison. I didn't need to. I'd already seen her cage long before the verdict. It wasn't made of bars, it was built from her own lies, from the endless need to control what couldn't be controlled. That was her punishment, to live surrounded by silence, the one thing she could never dominate. Sometimes I wondered if Daniel ever thought about me, if he regretted anything. I decided it didn't matter. Some ghosts didn't deserve haunting. One rainy afternoon, I received a letter in a plain white envelope. Inside was a short note written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. "I saw your story on TV. I'm still alive because of it." Thank you. No signature. No address. Just that. I pinned it above my desk next to a photo of my students smiling with their first finished paintings. Proof that survival multiplies. That night, I painted something new. It was a woman standing on a subway platform, not in fear this time, but in calm. The train thundered past and she didn't flinch. Above her, light spilled through the tunnel like sunrise. I titled it Survivor. I hung it in the gallery the following week. People stopped and stared, not knowing it was my story. They didn't need to. The painting said everything. As the exhibition ended, a reporter asked me, "What does justice mean to you now after everything?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "Justice isn't revenge," I said. "It's peace earned through truth. Revenge burns fast. Justice rebuilds slow, and healing is the quiet that follows." She wrote it down. The next morning, it became a headline on a local arts blog, "From Victim to Visionary, Claire Lewis Finds Peace Through Paint." I didn't feel like a visionary, just someone who had finally learned the difference between silence and surrender. The city moved around me loud alive, indifferent, and I was part of it again, breathing, creating free. On my way home that evening, I passed a woman standing near the edge of the subway platform, clutching her purse, nervous eyes darting at the train. Our eyes met briefly. I smiled and she smiled back. The train thundered past and neither of us moved. For the first time, I realized that survival wasn't about outliving the fall. It was about learning how to stand again when the ground stops shaking. And I had.